Stories that time forgot.
8 engineers, a secret lab, and a cardboard box containing the material that dominates your life today, but which was technically stolen under the cover of night. The silicon that built Silicon Valley in secret. Imagine for a moment that you are walking through the foggy streets of Mountain View, California in the year 1957. There are no glass skyscrapers or social media logos. There are only fruit orchards and a small laboratory where a man named William Shockley, recently awarded the Nobel Prize in Physics, is about to lose his empire because of his own arrogance. You might think that silicon, that material inside the device from which you are listening to me right now, was the result of a natural and peaceful evolution of science. But the reality is much murkier. It all began with a necessary betrayal and a classified document that should never have left a military safe. You must understand that, at that time, silicon was the great enemy of engineering. Everyone used germanium to manufacture transistors. Germanium was docile, easy to purify to 99.9%, and worked well in the pocket radios that were beginning to flood homes. But William Shockley, a genius with a personality as sharp as a scalpel, had an obsession. He knew that silicon was the future because it withstood extreme heat, but no one knew how to clean it of its natural impurities like boron or phosphorus. What no one in the laboratory knew was that Shockley kept a dark secret in his office. That brilliant but paranoid man had gained access to classified reports from the Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory and the International Business Machines Corporation, known worldwide as IBM. These documents, marked secret by the Department of Defense, detailed a process called floating zone. It was a military technique to purify silicon to levels that the civilian industry didn't even dream of. Shockley was using intercontinental ballistic missile technology to try to win a commercial race. And he was doing it without legal permission, under a work regime that you today would consider a nightmare of constant surveillance. Put yourself in the employee's shoes. Imagine working for a boss who installs microphones in the offices, who forces you to pass polygraph tests to know if you are loyal, and who forbids you from talking to your colleagues about any subject that is not strictly technical. That is how those we know today as the Traitorous Eight lived. Among them were Robert Noyce and Gordon Moore, the future founders of the Intel Corporation. These men were not rebels without a cause. They were brilliant scientists who realized that their boss was crossing very dangerous ethical and legal lines. The tension exploded in March 1957. Zhang Horney, a brilliant Swiss physicist, accidentally found a Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory report in a printer tray. The document was explicit. The use of those findings was strictly for national security purposes, and any commercial application required an authorization from the Department of Energy that Shockley did not possess. The engineers understood that they were working on a legal time bomb. If the United States federal government discovered the fraud, they would all go to jail. What would you have done in their place? They chose to escape. But they didn't leave empty-handed. On the night of June 25, 1957, taking advantage of the fact that Shockley was at a gala dinner in San Francisco, the 8 entered the building. With the precision of a special ops team, they recovered 27 silicon ingots that they themselves had helped purify using the forbidden techniques. Those ingots were not simple pieces of rock. They were the DNA of all modern technology. They wrapped them in plain paper, put them in office supply boxes, and walked out the back door. That night, silicon stopped being a state secret to become the pillar of a new industry. With that stolen material and an investment from the Fairchild Camera and Instrument Company, they founded Fairchild Semiconductor. But the pressure was suffocating. They had to prove they could improve the technology without directly copying the military documents to avoid the long arm of the law. And they succeeded. In April 1958, they perfected a method using an argon atmosphere, a noble gas, thus avoiding the hydrogen explosions that the military feared so much. Shortly after, Jean Horny invented the planar process, allowing transistors to be flat and mass-produced on a silicon wafer. It is fascinating to think that, while this was happening, giant firms like the Union Bank of Switzerland or the European Central Bank didn't even imagine that the global financial system would change forever. In fact, the first major client was not a bank or a television factory. It was the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, better known as NASA. The Traitorous Eight silicon transistors were the only ones capable of withstanding the journey on the Saturn V rocket to the moon. Silicon didn't conquer the world because it was cheap, but because it was the only material capable of surviving war and outer space. However, success brought scrutiny. In 1962, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the FBI, opened an investigation against Fairchild Semiconductor. Agents suspected that state secrets from Shockley's lab had been the basis of their success. Gordon Moore had to testify in closed sessions that were only made public a few years ago. His defense was brilliant. They admitted to having seen the data but claimed they only used it as a proof of concept to motivate themselves to find their own solution. The Department of Justice, overwhelmed by the economic success the company was bringing to the country, decided to close the case. The theft became a legend, and the legend became progress. Look around you. Every time you make a bank transfer through the international financial messaging system known as SWIFT, or when you check the value of your stocks at the Securities and Exchange Commission, you are using a direct descendant of those 27 stolen ingots. The paradox is incredible. Silicon Valley, the place that today preaches business ethics and transparency, was founded on an act of industrial espionage. William Shockley died alone and repudiated, maintaining until his last breath that his employees had stolen the 20th century from him. Meanwhile, the Traitorous Eight multiplied. From Fairchild Semiconductor, more than 60 new companies were born, including giants like Intel and Advanced Micro Devices. The venture capital ecosystem that today finances the largest companies in the world was born from the need to protect these 8 men after their flight. They didn't just create the chip. They created the way the modern world does business. Official history tells us that Silicon won because it was better. But you and I now know that it won because 8 people were willing to break the rules, to risk their freedom, and to carry the weight of being called traitors so that technology would stay locked in the basement of a paranoid man. It was a theft that, paradoxically, set the world free. Without that cardboard box full of gray ingots, we would probably still be living in the era of vacuum tubes. Now that you know the true story of the origin of the digital age, tell us what you think of this complex situation. Do you think the end justifies the means when it comes to a technological advance that benefits all of humanity? Your opinion is very important to us and helps us to understand the limits of ethics in science. So leave your answer in the comments to start a deep debate. Like and subscribe to discover more stories time forgot.